Hello and welcome to this session. This is the VR Writers' Room Live, hosted in association with BAFTA Scotland. We are very proud today to be able to introduce to you our lovely esteemed panel. We're going to start on the very far end. We have Dave Cook from Card Shark Comics with us. Ooh, did he just get a round of applause? Ooh, you've got fans in the room, Dave.
I don't know if that was a round, that was maybe a slice.
We've also got with us Dr. Dave Ranyard, two Daves because we want to make it confusing, who is the CEO of Dream Reality Interactive. We have with us Kate Edwards from the International Games Developers Association. We have with us Brian Baglow from Team Rock. And we have with us Sir Charles. No, it's not Sir. It's what is the?
There's an MBE at the end.
MBE. There's an MBE. There's a letter somewhere in here. Okay.
Usually
Charles.
has a man to remind people.
So Charles, Cecil from Revolution, and myself. I am Tanya Laird. I am the founder of Digital Jam and the creator of the VR Writers' Room. And today we are going to talk through the VR Writers' Room, which you can see the lovely diagram to our right. And we're going to start out with audience. Now, for those of you who are new to the VR Writers' Room, actually, just by show of hands, has anybody actually already either viewed the white paper, listened to any of the podcasts, or been to a VR Writers' Room live before? Not you. Put your hand down. We know you have. Anybody else? Okay, wonderful. No, this is expected. We expected this. So this is good.
Anyone heard of VR ever? No?
So the purpose... Hush, Brian. The purpose of the VR Writers' Room was to bring together a collection of different experts and areas of expertise across the different entertainment industries. This included representation from the game, film, TV, comic, theatre, immersive theatre, transmedia, and the theme park industries, who were represented in the original research. For the VR Writers' Room Live, we bring together other random professionals, as well as those who were in the original VR Writers' Rooms, to discuss the findings of the VR Writers' Room. So in this instance, we have original founding members Dave Cook, who was in the research. And Dave Ranyard, I'm going to kind of classify you as a kind of, honorary member, because you've done so many of the VR Writers' Rooms live now. But other than that, the rest of our collection are new to the actual research. So, having explained all of that, we are going to go through 4 key areas of discussion around the creation of narrative design for immersive entertainment. So I know it's a bit of a misnomer. We call it the VR Writers' Room. But this is actually relevant for anybody who is creating content for any immersive entertainment format, be that VR, AR, or mixed reality. So, starting with audiences. And the questions that we've had raised previously, there we go, there's a lovely diagram that outlines some of those key questions, was talking about the perspective of what the audience sees and how we as the narrator and the narrative designer can reframe the perspective for the audience. Now, for some of us who have lots of experience in this area, I'm going to start with you, Charles.
Oh dear.
Charles is just not really scared. When we're talking about the perspective for the audience, then our role as the controller of that audience, one of the things that is most commonly felt when we're creating VR content is that we lose control as the director, as the writer. We no longer have control because our audience has agency and they can look wherever they choose to look and not necessarily in the direction we would like them to look. So I'm curious from your perspective, Charles, when you are thinking about the creation of a narrative piece of content and a story, when we look at this in the context of audience and not being able to direct that audience necessarily, what your sentiments are around how we address that audience in the beginning of that process, how we introduce ourselves to that audience.
Okay, just to introduce myself, I write adventure games. We're best known for a game called Broken Sword, and before that, Beneath the Steel Sky. So I'm going to talk from an adventure perspective. And the thing about adventure games is that they are what we call multilinear. So they have linear paths, multiple linear paths, sort of running in parallel. And then we have nodes at which, before a major narrative advance takes place, we need to make sure that we know that the player has experienced all the narrative threads that then allow the plot to advance. So to answer your question, instinctively players will follow the path that makes the most sense, but they want to have the sense that actually they do have true agency. So the way, and it's a bit of a fudge, but the way that we would always do it is to reward players for looking around, for exploring, for trying things that are logical. The thing that turns audiences off straight away is if they try something that's logical but is wrong and they don't get some sort of response. In our case, we'd want, our games primarily will give you a humorous response. So my feeling is that audiences naturally will follow the narrative threads, that the breadcrumb trail that you lead for them. But they will always want to get the sense that they have the agency, they have the freedom within that world, and you should absolutely reward them for exploring the world.
Okay, so Dave Ranyard, because you're looking at me with that look, like you've got something to say about that. I'm going to ask you to follow up on this in as much as what Charles is saying about this idea of the breadcrumb and the illusion of control or agency is one that you're very familiar with from a games industry perspective. It's something we do all of the time. But I think that there is perhaps a distinction between how somebody who's coming at it from a games industry perspective is going to approach this versus somebody who's coming at it from a film industry or a theatre industry perspective and who's trying to create, for example, live 360 content might come at this. So I'm curious from your perspective how you might translate for somebody who is coming at this from the film industry side of things.
So I suppose from a games industry perspective, we're trying to get people to feel like they're actually doing the stuff. Whereas in a film, you might be... I mean, it comes back to, are you in the story or are you empathically enjoying the story through another character? So this is one of the things that I found really interesting in VR, particularly, is... So in traditional games or film, you've got to kind of fall in love with the lead character. And, you know, how many times have you seen a film and the lead character's been, like, clutching my fingernails off a cliff and actually you don't really care? Because you haven't fallen in love with the character, so for whatever reason for you as a person, you haven't got that empathy with them. Whereas certainly in virtual reality, you're that character, or you can be. That can be a narrative choice, that you're the character in the story. So if you're literally falling off a cliff, it's your own biological response, which is a much more powerful tool as a designer or as a creative. So I think that's one of the things I would come at. It's like that choice. But then second to that, it's how much time we allow the player or the viewer to actually be in that world doing things for themselves versus the story coming along. So if you watch a movie, it is linear and it is set for you. Some games, there's elements of that, and then you do stuff yourself. And I think that that's quite interesting. And again, if you get into VR, you might be in what we'd call a cutscene in a game, but actually you can do stuff. So somebody's talking to you, and in a traditional game, you kind of sit back, letterboxes, it's like, oh, I'm in the movie bit now. Whereas actually in VR, they can be talking to you, you could still be picking things up and looking at them. So then for immersion, you actually want that character talking to you to respond a bit to what you're doing. You know, so if somebody's telling you some stuff and you pick up a gun and point it at them, and they just carry on as if you haven't done that, that's going to break the immersion in terms of, well, it's not a very realistic response. But I think that that's getting to quite an interesting position where you can start to do that. Hey, hang on a minute, you know, and they kind of react to it, take the gun off you or something, and then carry on with the story.
So one of the things that you're talking about there is this instant empathy. And I think it is one of the fundamental differences between the approach to creating narrative from a games industry perspective versus a film industry perspective or a theatre industry perspective, which is that in a movie, we have 90 minutes essentially to build empathy and create that relationship with the character and care by the time we get to the end of that film that, you know, something world-ending is happening to them. Whereas in a game, we invest a certain period of time to create our avatar, to create that instant relationship, and then to be thrust into the action. And so there is an instant empathy that we gain when we're, you know, engaging in gameplay. But Charles, I think from your perspective...
So just very quickly, what I would say, just to build on all of that, is that when you play a game, because it is an active rather than a passive role, you need to motivate the player right from the start. So in a film, if I'm sure many of you will have heard of and probably seen Robert McKee, but he will talk about the fact that you can build empathy for up to a third of the film, so half an hour before you have the inciting incident. In a game, because you are actively engaging directly and because you're working, you need to have that empathy, you need to have that inciting incident to build empathy right at the very start, which is why we normally have cutscenes so that when you start the game, you know why you're there, you know what you're meant to be doing, and you can get going with this sense of anticipation and motivation. Sorry.
A purpose as well.
And a purpose.
But Kate, I'm interested from your perspective. One of the things that came up in the VR Writers' Room that we spoke a lot about was this idea that we need to set a standard, a benchmark of expectation for our audience. Now, I know you've done a huge amount of work in this area, especially with Microsoft. But one of the things that I think a lot of people are still trying to kind of get their heads around at this stage is this idea and this notion that actually when we create a VR experience or an immersive entertainment experience, there is a certain degree of responsibility for us as the content creator to actually set the expectation for our audience and to give them certain guidance as to what they can expect from an immersive entertainment experience. Because for many people, this is new. They don't understand how this medium works and they've never done this before. And so certainly for the next kind of, 5 years or so, we're helping to educate that audience. And I'm curious from your perspective what your take is on this in terms of how we approach that education and setting that standard and that bar.
Well, I think it's going to be really challenging because, one of the problems that we're having is fighting our own paradigms of film versus game versus TV versus theater, and it's like that needs to just go out the window. It really does, and I know there's kind of it's hard because when we're entering uncharted territory, it's like we got to have something to hold on to. And so we're kind of grasping on these paradigms of storytelling from games and film and whatnot and using those as a basis for how it goes forward. But I think in 5 or 10 years, what we're actually going to see is going to be so different. And it's going to be driven by the audience. It's going to be driven by the consumer, whatever you ever want to call them, in terms of what they want to engage with. I do think right now, it's really critical that we do set expectations. And I do think it's very similarly how when in a lot of games these days, they follow a very similar pattern, like you were mentioning how, there's the opening setup, it's like, here's why your character is there, here's what your mission is, and now go forth and do your thing. Although some games are starting to break away from that. So you look at something like the more sandbox games, like something like Skyrim, which I think is a very good example, because Skyrim has a narrative track, which I kind of liken to this. It's very similar to like going in the Haunted Mansion at Disneyland. You get on the Omnimover, and it just takes you through the experience in a linear fashion, and so you can do the main quest and do, then you're done if you want to be done. I know people who never did the main quest. They did every other little side quest. Some people didn't do any of that either. They just kind of wandered and did their own thing, but they still had a fulfilling experience. And I think part of what we have to set up as an expectation is that's okay. If you don't do the main narrative, which is generally why the product was created, why the game was created, or whatever the experience was created, it's okay if you don't do it. Because ultimately, it's like, what are we serving to the audience? It's like we are serving distraction, entertainment, whatever you want to call it, and if they're satisfied with what they're getting out of it, I don't think it's up for us to judge, like, well, you didn't go through the story that I wrote.
So you're a bad player.
Yeah, you're a bad player, how dare you? It's just like, well, of course they could counter and say, well, maybe you didn't write a very engaging narrative. You set it up for me, but then I wasn't interested in it, so I just went and did my own thing. But I think in the short term, there is going to be a certain level, and I think we're still trying to figure out what exactly that's going to look like in VR, but kind of setting up, okay, this is what you do in this kind of experience, because I do think a lot of people, it's so nascent for so many people, we do have to provide a certain level of guidance.
I think it's interesting what you're saying as well here in terms of the idea of new terminology or the fact that this is a new medium. There are so many people who are coming to, whether it's VR or AR or MR or whatever initials you want to give it people, but they are coming at this and they're saying, you know what, there is an expectation that there should be genres, there should be methodologies and processes and software available to make this stuff happen. And we forget that actually, when we think about this, if we look at the film industry, we started out with the steam engine coming at you in black and white. And it took about 100 years to get to, Avatar and where we are in terms of filmmaking. With games, we started out with Pong, and it took us a good chunk of years to get to The Last of Us. And yet, with VR content creation, it's been around for maybe 30 years, and yet we somehow have the expectation that it will have created its own subgenres, its own methodology, its own terminology, and its own processes within the space of 30 years. And I'm not sure quite how we are thinking that it's going to magically do that in the space of 30 years. But what that does bring us to is this interesting shift in approach and attitude to what the audience needs and why they need it. And so one of the areas that we do discuss in the VR Writers' Room is this idea of actually preparing our audience for VR and preparing for fatigue, which isn't something that traditionally as a film writer, or even to a certain extent a game writer, you necessarily need to worry about. This idea that your audience will need preparation when they embark into an immersive universe of any sort. There needs to be some padding for them mentally to prepare themselves to enter into your universe and your environment. But there also needs to be opportunity for them to actually feel safe within that environment and to have a moment to be able to calmly step away from it all, which is, it's kind of Resident Evil safe room mode, if you like, depending on what you're creating in VR. But I'm curious to hear from your perspective, Dave, and I mean Dave Cook at this stage, what your sentiment is on this in terms of this idea of needing to have that transitionary process and that transitionary mode, if you like, to prepare the audience as they enter and exit into this virtual or immersive environment.
I think it's like so many other games out there that there's never one consistent pace and one consistent tone running throughout games. I've spoken with the guys who made Call of Duty before, and they have this process where it's like, basically it's like a timeline of the whole game. They have a level 1 moment, and then a level 2 moment, and a level 1, and then it ramps all the way up to 5, and there's a big chase sequence, and it kind of comes back down again. Because you can't be always on it, right? I mean, because that itself would start to become quite dull. But if you're talking about, sensory overload in VR, yeah, you probably do need a bit of a breather. I mean, the Resident Evil example is really good, actually, because, yeah, when you find one of those rooms, you're kind of like, okay, I'm safe now. Just, I can relax.
I can run to the bathroom now.
Exactly. So, yeah, I mean, I play a lot of Dark Souls. Who here plays Dark Souls? Anyone? Why can't you pause that game? It's the most annoying thing ever. Like you're in the middle of a fight and you just want to go to the bathroom where the phone goes. And so, yeah, I think you do need, like... And I'm sure this is something that will creep out over time, right? Is the more studies are done on how players react when they're inside that VR world, how often do they need a break? I mean, Nintendo's quite good at popping up little alerts on the screen that says, you've been playing for an hour, maybe you'd like to take a 15-minute break or something. And that's, some people might find that quite intrusive, like, oh, why you tell me how to play the game and what I should do with it. But yeah, I don't know. And I guess it's something that will come out when there's more studies done, I suppose. How long can someone be in that world before it starts to take a toll and they need a bit of a break? And it's, like you say, I mean, games industry in the grand scheme of things is still an infant, compared to like music and film, right? So we're only just going to learn more and more about this as it goes. We're scratching the surface,
Okay. So, Brian, what's your sentiment on this in terms of this idea that from an audience perspective, we as the content creators need to decide on the degree of agency that the audience actually has?
I think one of the biggest issues that we have, and it becomes clear the more discussions I see about VR, is that we have a fundamental disconnect between the different industries involved. Mm-hmm. Film and games are made in very different ways, and there are some fundamentals in that which I don't think we're even aware of as the content creators. So you cannot start a film, a television program, or a play without a script. It's totally possible to finish a game without one. Then get the writer in.
Yeah.
And then that poor bastard has to try and hammer some sense into it. So, you can find an awful lot of problems just purely in terms of who you're dealing with when it comes to VR. My own company at the moment, we're having a massive war because the games team are entirely convinced that virtual reality is theirs, mm-hmm. and our video team are entirely convinced that it's theirs. Mm-hmm. And the reality is, as Kate said, as a couple of people have mentioned, the audience are going to decide. Mm-hmm. And it's, in some ways, we need to get over ourselves. The games approach and the film approach are going to differ, but it's going to be the audience who decides what they want and how this comes about. Mm. And I think one of the things we as the games industry are incredibly bad at is putting the consumer first and putting the player first. Mm-hmm. Again, to go back to Dave's point, the ramping difficulty level. Do you know how many people never finish a game because of that very thing? Mm-hmm. There are games that I absolutely adore, and at a certain point I will drop out because it's like, I'm not playing that bit again. God damn it. You don't have that with film. You don't have a film that gets increasingly more challenging as you go through. Mm. Comedians like Dara O'Brien and anyone who's a gamer make jokes about this very thing, mm-hmm. which is the film doesn't stop and then you've got to answer 5 questions before you get to watch the next chunk. And we seem to be hung up on a number of tropes from film and from games when it comes to this new and nascent and emerging and evolving technology. And rather than sit down and sort of sing Kumbaya and all get together and figure out what the hell we do with it, we're immediately at loggerheads, which is the games approach and the film approach. And I think we are causing a lot of our own problems. So in some ways, we need to relax a little bit and stop trying to force the issue. Because until we have a significant footprint of devices out there in the hands of the punters and the people who use it, we're second-guessing ourselves, and we're leaping ahead of ourselves, and we're trying in a lot of ways to solve problems that don't actually exist yet. The whole fatigue thing, yeah, I'm sure it will exist, but at the moment, it's only people who are either die-hard gamers or people from the film industry who are interested in VR who are kind of running into this. And I think we're hitting the sort of the hype and iterative cycle, which is like, oh my God, we need to solve a problem that we don't actually know is going to exist yet. Rather than sort of go, okay, right, we know what the technology can do, we can do some really cool stuff. I've seen some fantastic demos, but they're demos. They're not going to be something that people go out and pay money for. It'll be the kind of, that was really cool, I enjoyed that. And from an industry point of view, as a geek, I'm totally interested in VR. As a content creator, until these things are out on the market and we see people are using them, there's no way I'm going to jump in or start throwing money at this. Because we still don't quite know how to make mobile games consistently that will earn money. The failure rate in there is horrendous. So trying to second guess the VR market, I think, is something where we just need to sit down, chill out, guys, have a beer.
Which you can all do at the end of this session, by the way. Thanks to Back to Scotland. Actually, what I wanted to ask you, Dave Ranyard, because you obviously have quite a lot of experience with Sony and what you guys were doing with PlayStation, I am curious to hear from your perspective whether or not you do think that there is a certain degree of maybe anticipating issues or anticipating what the challenges will be, or whether or not you feel that, in terms of where Sony has been with this, that you've already faced some of those challenges.
Well, I mean, I definitely think that the headsets that are coming out, Sony and Oculus 5 and the mobile ones, are good enough for consumers to use. I mean, but I think of it like, if you remember the very first mobile phones, right? These huge bricks. We kind of joke about the bricks, and how inconvenient they are to use to charge. You probably get an hour's life out of them. They're really expensive. You'd have to stand on the roof to get a signal. But people, the early adopters and so on would use them, and I think we're kind of there, to be honest. And look at what mobile phones, smartphones are now. I mean, they're amazing. It's basically a computer in your pocket. You can't live without one, blah, blah, blah. So I think we need to think of it like that. So they're fit for purpose, definitely, and there's some great experiences. But there's a lot to do. I mean, like the high-end sets are tethered. It's expensive. They're clunky on your head. Those things. Now, you can get great experience. I think that the fatigue issue is a great example. I think we probably do need to tailor our content at this stage into chapters, but more because of the physicality of what you're strapping a big thing to your head. So if that was like putting some glasses on, forget it. It doesn't matter. You could be there for hours. I mean, the trite answer to that thing is when they first invented the train, they said the human body couldn't go at more than 25 miles an hour.
And they were right.
I'm pretty sure most of us have been more than 25 miles an hour today, and every day of our lives. So I think that will be an issue that goes away. But in terms of creating a market, and we need to do the best we can. So I think of chaptering things up into convenient 20-minute blocks. So if you want to go on, you can happily go on, but also you've got a good save point and you've got a kind of natural mini conclusion after, say, 20 minutes, so that you can relax a bit.
Okay. So, lovely slide person, would you be able to move us on to the next slide, please? Which should be world building. So, in the context of the original purpose, which is that we're focusing very much on narrative design and the creation of writing for VR or immersive entertainment, I want to talk through some of these issues that were kind of raised during the original VR Writers' Room. I'm going to start with you, Dave Cook, since you was there You as one of the culprits. I want to talk about this kind of notion of the World Bible that was discussed and the importance and the focus of this World Bible. So why don't you throw it out there for us and explain to our lovely audience exactly what that means?
Yeah, so it's one of these things where I always use this example when I'm talking to people about writing a script and creating a new world and whatnot. It's silly things like, you can't write a story where suddenly someone is trapped in a locked room, but maybe 5 issues of comics ago you established they were a good lockpicker, right? Or they had a lockpicking kit in their pocket. Like, that just doesn't work, and that just immediately breaks your flow. Or, I think when you're coming up with a new world, you have to always question, oh, this thing happened, or this is like a rule in this world, and you have to think why, and you have to ask that question. Okay, well, why is that? And then just say why until basically it's bulletproof, and then you think that's a good idea. Otherwise, if there's holes in your world, people will start to read your comic or play your game and be like, well, that makes no sense because the guy could just kick down that door. But another one is it's like Call of Duty, right? I always go back to Call of Duty. I love it, but it's got a lot of sort of issues that are relevant to this, where your guy's trapped in the room and a bomb's about to go off, but there's a window there. Oh, you can't shoot it because the game designers, and climb out because the game designers have deemed it as like an invisible wall. It's just like, well, that's just completely immersion breaking. You want obviously you need boundaries, right, in games, but I think if it doesn't make sense in your world, that just breaks the flow and it breaks the believability and the immersion. And I think people are, I've never underestimated the ability of an audience to pick holes in a story. Batman v Superman, Suicide Squad, right? Which I enjoyed, for the record. But
let's not go there. Let's not go there.
At the moment because that didn't make sense. That narrative decision. That character did a stupid thing or said a stupid thing. The people notice these things, right? And you can't really pull the wool over their eyes. If people love your an IP so much, they will scrutinize it a lot. So I think you need this Bible to explain why the world is in the way it is, why people act a certain way, if someone's because I'm writing a fantasy comic at the moment, the first issue's out, but, I'm starting to think ahead now, so we've established the character, one character's a mage, for example, and he's got these magical powers, he's really powerful. So I need to not box him into a situation where it's like, oh, well, he could just use a magic blast to take that guy's head off and win, or he could get out of that situation using this magic skill that we've established. You need to think, what are the parameters? How powerful is this guy? What's his weaknesses? What's the limitations? You can't have... That's one reason I actually don't like Superman as a character, but to be fair, because he is so powerful. He's so powerful. He's got weaknesses, and the writers do a good job of...
Kryptonite.
Kryptonite, yeah.
Okay, so geeking out in the end is going on. I'm going to move to you, Kate. What I want to talk about is the fact that actually a lot of what Dave is saying is obviously covered in that slide. You've literally covered every point. Thanks, Dave.
Good value from Dave.
Good value. But this notion that actually, when we talk about the creation of a world environment or a universe within an immersive entertainment environment, one of the reasons why we're focusing so much on this idea of world building and establishing this universe and establishing the rules of this universe is because ultimately, when we are in a fully immersive, engaged universe, and so by that I mean true VR, anything that we do has impact. It has resounding impact. It's like the pebble dropping into the pond and the ripple effect that we see that happens after that. When you do something in this game, it's not just a case of I walk into an environment, I speak to that person, I walk away and nothing happens. It actually is something that, I have that conversation, that character then has a conversation with another character, and maybe that piece of information comes up further down the line through a completely different character, but that character has had interaction with other characters that have, somehow had an interaction. And so we suddenly have this kind of ripple cascade effect that we wouldn't normally have to worry about. And so actually, when we're creating for VR or an immersive entertainment medium, suddenly we actually have to become more of a transmedia storyteller. We have to actually be much more complex about the way that we think about how this universe exists and what the ground rules are for that universe. If there's gravity in this universe, then it needs to be consistent gravity across the entirety of that universe. I'm curious from your perspective, obviously you've dealt with a lot of franchises who have had, these kind of challenges and these kind of questions that have been raised about, how do we lay this all out for the audience to understand what these ground rules are. And given that this is probably quite a new challenge for certainly most people in this room, I'm going to make a broad sweeping assumption. What would you say to people who are coming at this for the first time and trying to understand why they need to create this benchmark?
Well, I think, I mean, this is kind of up my alley. I'm actually giving a talk tomorrow at GDC Europe called A Geographer's Guide to World Building, because that's my background as a geographer working in the game industry for over 20 years. Like geographers and cartographers, which I was a cartographer at one point, that's exactly what we do. We build worlds. We look at the world as it exists, and we basically generalize it, categorize it, think about the systems that exist. And I think the first thing that I would recommend to people who are going to be building worlds, the story Bible is essential for the narrative aspect, but I think even before you get to the story Bible, you need to have a sense of how worlds work. And so one of the biggest things that I've had to do in my career in the game industry when I've worked on all these different franchises, whether it's real world-based games or whether it's a fantasy world-based game, is help educate the developers on different interconnectivity of systems. And one of the biggest points that I often have to educate them on is on the notion of logical consistency. And so a lot of the worlds, when they lack logical consistency, which is kind of like what you were pointing at about like gravity needs to work the same everywhere, well, unless you have a good reason for it not to. You know, so you can always have exceptions, you can always have anomalies, but the anomalies should have a logical reason to exist within the world. I mean, to me, this is one of the things that has made, which it's kind of the seminal world that we all point to, but you look at Tolkien's universe that he created, there's a logical consistency there that makes it feel real, and it makes it feel like it makes sense, even though it's completely fantasy. And so in that sense, but a lot of it is because he was a student of geography, he was a student of history, he was a student of languages. And so he understood the way our world works and the way the systems work, and he was able to build his own layered world that sort of mimicked the authenticity of this world. And I think so VR designers, environment designers, they need to understand those fundamentals. And I mean, I've had to explain simple things, well, maybe not simple, but like, you know, geomorphology and how it works. I've advised on projects where someone has shown me like an island they created, and I said, okay, that can exist, but it doesn't make sense because the mountains would not form that way, and you know, they'll say, well, I've got a reason for that. Okay, great, you've got a reason. Just like Mordor, there's no reason why it would be a squared-off mountain range like that. But you know, you could say, well, maybe Morgoth did his magic and made a wall of mountains. I don't know, but you know, so there needs to be that logical reason that builds the world, and I think in order to build that world and to, you know, basically be able to set a narrative in a space, you need to understand how space is constructed and kind of understand those fundamentals.
Absolutely. And I think it is very important to understand that actually there is this inherent relationship to both, as you say, the narrative kind of architecture of how this stuff works, as well as the kind of physicality of the economies within this universe and how they need to work as well. Mm-hmm. Dave, you're looking like you've got something to throw in here. Just interested. But what I want to do is I want to move on to this notion that actually to create a viable and valid present within a universe, we need to understand the history. And this is going back again to kind of the Tolkien approach, which is if we understand it and you have established the ground rules of this history, and we understand the reasons for why things exist, why the status of the world exists in the way that it does, we're able to build both the present but also the future of that universe and that environment. But I'm really interested to hear from you, Charles, because obviously you've done a lot of experimentation with historical storytelling and you know, creating that narrative from a historical perspective. What you would say to people who are trying to kind of get their head around the scope of not only do I need to explain the rules of the world and how it works and how it physically works and narratively works, but I also need to explain this huge, deep history of this universe in order for people to actually understand the ground rules of the politics or the racial history or the scientific history or whatever else it may be.
Okay, well, the way that we write our Broken Sword games is that there's been a conspiracy, a historical conspiracy that resonates into the present day, and that then sets up the puzzles. And that works very well because it allows us to convey the history. And the way that we approach it, sorry, I'm going to go back to the previous thing slightly, is write a short story which is maybe 4 pages long, so it doesn't go into great detail, but it gives them the key emotional beats. And then in a separate document, write the game design, so that ultimately what we want is we want great narrative and gameplay moments to climax at the same time. And we do that from both sides. And so throughout our development, there's a story document that gets bigger. And we, until by the end, it's 15, 20 pages long, and it's written as you would expect. And if you give it to somebody and they read it and they're not excited, then you haven't done your job well. And on the other, you have the complementary gameplay. And the two are always separate, but the two are living documents. They move forward in parallel, so that each one is always supporting. I'm a bit like a politician. I've answered a slightly different question.
But to actually
answer your question, and there is a third document, which is the historical background, and it's. I don't know. Is anybody a huge fan of the Da Vinci Code here? No hands. No hands. Good. Oh, good.
Dan Brown was here.
So, lots of our fans have noticed that Broken Sword and the Da Vinci Code have very, very similar stories, particularly at the beginning. And Broken Sword came, 6, 7, 8 years before the Da Vinci Code. So anyway, but what Dan Brown did do reasonably well is to interweave the history into the narrative, and to do that, he spent an awful lot of time reading the Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, and using a lot of that, and those conspiracies work. But ultimately, what you have to make sure is that there is that the history which resonates into the modern day actually is meaningful to the modern day plot. Otherwise, it's just there for the sake of creating some sort of historical novel.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so lovely slide person, could you bump us along to the next slide, please? So we're going to look at technology and technique. I'm really aware that we only have 15 minutes left, so we're not going to get through all of this. But if anybody's interested, feel free to come and grab us afterwards, because, hey, we've got drinks with BAFTA. I'm going to keep saying this, because you're all going to get drunk. So from a technology and technique perspective, we're looking at essentially what are the tools that we would need in order to facilitate this creation of immersive entertainment. And by this, we're talking about basic fundamentals of how do we write a script that is understood universally from both a film writer's perspective or a game writer's perspective who are creating a VR script. And really great examples of this is somebody using Final Draft and opening with we open on, we see this, we see that. It's like, no, you don't, because it's VR, and we can't assume that our audience can see what you want them to see and is in your frame, because we don't have a frame anymore. And so I am interested to understand from your perspective, Dave, and I mean Cook on the end. Obviously, with comics, you already have this limitation. You have panels, and there is already this limitation. And I'm interested to hear from you, because I know that one of the things that we spoke a lot about during the research was these alternative approaches to the way that we would articulate the scope of movement and the scope of direction, because we're no longer writing, for a frame like so. We're now writing for a 360 audience that goes around, but also goes over as well and underneath us. So I want to hear your thoughts on this.
It's an interesting one, yeah, because there's a lot of games like things like Amnesia and Soma, for example, where I was replaying Soma recently, actually. I don't know if anyone's played it, but I was kind of walking around, kind of looking around, and then all I heard was this like audio cue, like a jump scare and something happening behind me, and I was like, oh, I missed that, right? So I think that's kind of what we're talking about here is, right, if you can look around everywhere and you have this free autonomy to move wherever you want, you are going to miss things, right? Or you're not going to get the experience that the creator intended. But yeah, with comics, it's like, we see from this angle that these two people are standing here, one in the foreground, one in the background, they're doing X, Y, Z, establishing some objects, for example. And that's rigid, right? That's static. But yeah, I mean, we had this notion, I think, at one of the sessions of reining people in and keeping it on rails for some bits, and then having like little pockets, like nodes almost, where you can, like areas where you can walk around and observe things. I mean, has anyone here played Uncharted 4 on PS4? That's a low amount of people. It's a good game if you get it. But there's this, and not to spoil it, there's a bit towards the end where you basically are given this space, this like sandbox where you can walk around. And the game doesn't really hold your hand. You can walk straight to the end of the section and move on, or you can walk around. And it's almost like a virtual museum, right? You can pick up objects and get a feel for like, what's happening, and sort of it's such a great bit of game design where you can just take as much or as little bit as you want and then just move on and still have you know, some sort of experience. You know, you can have an experience which is sort of tailored to you almost. You know, I know the people who just went straight to the end and they loved what they played. I spent ages in this section just like picking up artifacts and whatnot and looking at things and just thinking like, this is great. So I think that's maybe one way to do it, almost take that sort of virtual museum approach where you can interact with things and get the story. But I think one of the conclusions, every time we spoke about this on the podcast, I think it just blows my mind, like having to comprehend what that looks like, this form of storytelling that encompasses all of this in a way that everyone's happy. I'm sure it must exist somewhere, but I can't comprehend it. But
well, the interesting thing is that this software and these technologies and techniques do exist. They just don't exist in film or game, which is, again, another great reason why we need to be looking outside of our own existing industries, look towards other industries. So the planetariums and astrological industry have been doing this for a very long time in terms of articulating what goes on in a full, 360 round. The immersive theatre industries have, for a long time, had to be able to articulate, the difference of direction of what is happening action-wise, because it's no longer a flat, a straight stage. It's actually a full immersive stage that actors are moving through. But this does bring me to another interesting point that we did cover in this, which is that the fact that actually performance for immersive entertainment, whether that is VR or AR or whatever it may end up being, from an artist's perspective, and by that I mean an actor, is actually a completely different technique. It's a completely different performance technique that does need to be considered. There's going to need to be some re-education and a little bit of shifting in the way that people approach this, because it's not really something that a traditional TV or film actor is necessarily going to have the experience for. It's maybe something that a motion capture artist might have a little bit of a better understanding for. But actually, the immersive theatre industry probably have the talent that is closest to understanding this, because they are used to the idea of not just multiple directional acting and interaction with the audience and allowing the audience to have impact on the outcomes, but the fact that they actually have to memorize and learn multiple sets of stories and multiple outcomes just within the scope of the immersive theatre that they're learning. I'm interested to hear from you on this one, Brian, what your thoughts are in terms of alternative approaches to performance and performance art.
If you want a fantastic example of how performers from the screen industries can have a huge problem when it comes to games, go on YouTube and check out Christopher Walken's performance in Ripper. I use this in a class that I teach where I talk to screenwriters. And nobody can actually believe that an actor with so much experience can be so awful. And I do mean awful. I think, again, this comes back to the issue of the fundamental disconnect. And we do have a whole variety of different industries that are now trying to anticipate the opportunities which are opening up through virtual reality and through the immersive entertainment media that are emerging. One of the issues that we have is that I believe, again, it comes back to the approach. Film directors are used to looking for a very specific performance. When you drop that same activity into an interactive experience, it can fundamentally change. And interactive theatre's an interesting one, because when you look at that within the confines of virtual reality, you can end up breaking the consistency. You can end up creating a scene, let's say, that simply doesn't work. So I think it comes back to the whole idea of consistency and the actual vision holder, whether that's a director or a designer, whatever this role is, the person who has the creative vision for the project is going to have to be technically aware and creatively aware. And that's something that I think we are going to have to figure out fairly quickly. Because at the moment, the different approaches from all of the different sectors that you've mentioned clash. Because, even when it comes to film, the vision holder for film is the director, for games it's the designer.
It's all about this unified
or possibly
terminology.
The producer. But I think it comes back to exactly what Kate was saying. the term I use is a story architect or a world architect, because it's not all about just delivering lines. It's not about parroting a script, whatever tools you use. It's how do you actually deliver the narrative? How do you bring in the story arc that is actually makes use of the technology that's available? And again, I don't think we're there yet. You know, which is why so many of the cool things in the demos are experiences rather than stories.
Yes.
And forgive me for doing bunny ears. But, you know, if you want to stand on top of Everest and feel sick, great. But we're not quite at Pride and Prejudice yet. We're not even at Pride and Prejudice and zombies yet. So.
Okay, so lovely slide person. Can we go to the last slide? So I'm not going to talk through this last slide, but I'm aware that some people are taking photos of the slides, so I'm going to make sure that goes up there so you can actually take a photo if you want. But what I am going to do is open it to questions. So if anybody does have a question, please do direct it at our lovely esteemed panel.
And if not, I'll add something.
At the back there, we have a question. Do we have any microphones?
Oh, good.
Microphone is on the way to you, young man.
Hello, I just have a question to somebody who works in the film industry about how you get games companies, which are very good at protecting their IP, and film companies, which are very good at protecting their IP, to work together, as opposed to having all these rights languish in between, where there's very little crossover. You've got games companies making bad movies, you've got bad games coming from films. I was just wondering what your thoughts would be on that, because I know it's kind of related to how we're talking about the intertextuality of all these mediums.
Brian's desperate to say something.
Yeah, I have a huge issue with this. It comes down to licensing, and licensing intellectual property. So it's not an actual creative collaboration. It's down to you've got IP that we want to exploit, or vice versa. Which is why, you know, the Doom movie sucked so hard, and why pretty much every film adaptation, Electronic Arts, was basically the same engine. You know, Lord of the Rings and James Bond and Harry Potter were the same game. Let's be absolutely honest. But we don't have these collaborations.
But I think that there is a path forwards in this, which I will cover in a moment, but I know Charles has got something to say too.
All I'd like to add is that I think we need to be aware, I mean, going back to what we said earlier about the core differences, and the empathy is one. So in a game, you don't have time to create empathy. So licenses should work very well. So if you, notwithstanding what Brian's just said, so, you know, if you're playing Harry Potter...
Oh, they can work.
Yeah. If you're playing Harry Potter, then you don't need, as a games designer, you don't need to create the empathetic relationship, because it comes forward. The reason that it doesn't work in reverse is because our characters have to be created or presented to the audience pretty quickly, and that means that they often don't have the depth that would be expected from a movie. And that's... You know, and you know, there are some exceptions, but you look at Tomb Raider, and if it wasn't for Angelina, that would have sucked too. You know, I mean, she was just magnificent. So she took a pretty mediocre script and turned it into a great movie, but there are very few examples. And I think it's because of the structural differences between the interactive experience and a passive experience.
And also, the reason for doing licensing is primarily financial.
Yes.
It's not a creative...
It's not a creative relationship.
Yeah.
But in direct answer to your question, sorry, what was your name?
Stephen.
Steve, in answer to your question, Steve, from a VR and immersive entertainment perspective, I think what you're going to start seeing is more people negotiating for the entire franchise rights, so that they have the opportunity to develop immersive entertainment solutions within the context of the wider franchise, because immersive entertainment is not a standalone solution. It is not a standalone medium at this stage, and somebody who's doing VR just for VR's sake is either A, really ignorant, or B, just got a lot of money to waste, because it's not really a plausible way of actually delivering VR at this point in time.
Can I just add, I think a company that does this very well is Telltale Games, because some of their games are better than others, but I mean, don't play Jurassic Park, terrible. But The Walking Dead is a good example, Game of Thrones as well, because they weren't based on, they had the name of the IP, they were set within that world with the world's rules, so there's a connection to the audience member, right? If you're a fan of Game of Thrones, yeah, of course you're going to buy it, right? But they got around the whole, you know, you can't really change up the rules of an IP too much if it's an established character. You can't kill off Harry Potter in a Harry Potter game, right? But they did it where they based it on side stories, news stories within that world. So you still have the emotional attachment to the IP, but there's these blank slate characters they can build up and kill off, and you never know everyone's fair game. Anyone can be killed off at any moment. They get around that quite well doing that. It's still financially driven, right? But
it's taking a much more transmedia franchise approach, and allowing people to explore different aspects of that franchise through different mediums, rather than trying to just keep on duplicating the same stories across all of the different platforms. But did anybody else have any questions? Thank you, Steve. Anybody else?
Hello.
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 Do you need gameplay at all?
Say again?
Do you need gameplay at all? I mean, at this stage, have we started making games without gameplay? You talk about immersive experiences, but is anyone started making a VR game without any gameplay? It's just discoverable narrative.
So you're talking about kind of more of a sandbox environment narrative?
Yeah, but when you talk about sandbox, you're talking about having Skyrim things. Your investigate still have strands in play. I'm talking something closer to some stuff Punch Drunk did.
Yeah.
When you just spread a story out across the space.
But even in the context... But even in the context of something like Punch Drunk, or if you're looking at any kind of immersive theatre experience, there is still fundamentally an architecture of narrative within that. And so that's why, for example, some people who experience immersive theatre and didn't figure out all of the component parts come away from it going, that was really shit, I don't understand what was going on, is because they didn't actually experience the structure that was created for them.
That's what I'm saying, not in terms of not getting rid of the narrative is really fundamental to that.
Yeah.
I actually think that's some of where we are right now, which is some of the reactions I've been getting from people who are not familiar with VR, and maybe they're not like really avid game players, because I think right now a lot of the stuff we're seeing are VR experiences. They're not games necessarily. We're starting to see more actual gameplay kind of stuff, but a lot of the people that I've talked to who've gone and tried these experiences, they're kind of confused. They're like, oh, so that's VR. I just kind of walk around and don't really do anything, or I'm supposed to discover stuff on my own. And some people like that. I mean, if you've been watching the reviews of No Man's Sky over the last week or so, some people love just the pure notion of exploration discovery. Some people hate it. They want to be on a rail. They want a narrative. And so I think it's going to be really interesting to see how it appeals to all these different audiences. And I think right now, though, we're in a stage, at least in my view, is we're very heavy on the experience side and very light on the narrative/game side in VR.
So in answer to your question, yes, there's a lot of experiences with no gameplay. One last question over here.
Hi. So my experience of VR and augmented reality is a sort of a solo experience, and I'm curious what are current applications in terms of social applications, or are there live event things or multiplayer things that are available now or are being envisioned?
So VTime is a great place to go and experience collaborative social experiences in VR. Alt VR is also another kind of persistent virtual world that you can go explore.
I actually think that this is probably the most useful part of VR for gaming VR is, so multiplayer for traditional games is huge, right? Because basically, by playing with your friends, you can play the same game and it's different every time. Yep. Whether people are playing FIFA or Call of Duty multiplayer. And for me, the promise of VR is to go somewhere. Right, so one of the examples I use, I've often shown a video of my mum being attacked by a shark in VR. And actually my son, who's down here, did it at the same time. There he is, waving. And it was a social experience for all of us, because my mum didn't want to go and do that as a solo experience, come out and never talk about it. She talks about it while she was in there, and that afternoon and evening as well, and so did Eddie. And actually, that for me, that made me realise what a great opportunity social VR is. And I think that the real dream is to go somewhere with your friends, do something really cool. That for me is what VR will become, and I think that will be the draw, because as human beings we want to connect with other people. and to do it in a cool place, doing something that you couldn't do in the real world. That's the
and there are people who are developing these experiences already. So if you look at things like zero latency, you know, it's a warehouse experience. Think of it's kind of like Laser Quest back in the day. You know, you stick the backpack on with a supercomputer, you put your headset on, you've got your gun, and you're basically shooting zombies. But you're playing that game with other players, so you can have between 6 to 8 players in that environment with you, and you're playing with your mates. And you know, you're in a big warehouse basically chasing invisible zombies, which is great. But people are already experimenting with that, and I think that Dave's right in as much as the next kind of big exploration for VR and immersive entertainment is going to be this collaborative and social experience that people are going to want to not just turn up and be on some, you know, beautiful beach somewhere, you know, the other side of the world. They're going to want to do that and be able to connect with other people who are not in the same room with them, but somewhere else in the world in a third-party environment. So
just going back to licensing as well, we touched on that, but there's the new Star Trek one that's coming out.
That's a great example.
Which is like you're on the bridge of the Enterprise, and you and all your mates or multiplayer people can walk around and be crew members on the ship, which is so
but
cool.
You all need to work together in order to actually function and fly the ship.
Yeah.
So, you know, you've got maybe 4 or 5 people all working their consoles, you know, within that same collaborative environment. But if you didn't have everybody doing the right thing, then the ship wouldn't be moving forward. So, you know, these are great examples of people who are already experimenting with that kind of social collaborative play. But guys and girls, I want to thank you all for joining us today on this VR Writers' Room Live. You have been listening to Dave Cook, Dave Ranyard, Kate Edwards, Brian Baglow, and Charles Cecil. Thank you so much for joining us, and do join us for drinks.